Good evening, and welcome to the Nina Maria Gorison lecture, Learning from the Father of Lies, by Suzanne Marchand, who is the Fall 2022 Nina Maria Gorison Fellow in History here at the American Academy in Berlin. Dear Suzanne, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you here tonight and the whole semester at the Academy. Inaugurated in 2011 with the generous support of the legendary Nina von Malzahn, this fellowship has granted two outstanding scholars fellowships to the American Academy per year. This fall, it is Suzanne, the Boyd Professor of History at Louisiana State University, which is the highest professional rank awarded by the LSU system. Suzanne is one of the foremost thinkers in European and German intellectual history in the United States, and her research focuses on intellectual history, the history of the human sciences, but mostly she is a historian of scholarly disciplines such as classical studies, archaeology, and art history. She also works on related topics in the history of material culture and consumption in Central Europe. As a prolific academic, she authored a great number of articles, but Suzanne, being the humble person that she is, asked me to be brief. So I refer you to her website to check out her articles. And I will only recommend her most recent book, Porcelain, A History from the Heart of Europe. It was published with Princeton University Press in 2020. It is a history of the porcelain industry in Germany from its alchemical origins in the early modern Saxon court to its 20th century survival against all odds in East Germany. Among others, Suzanne's work has been supported by the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, where she was a fellow in the fall of 2018, the Wissenschaftskolleg Berlin, and the American Council of Learned Societies. At the Academy this fall, and in her talk tonight, Suzanne turns to the father of history, Herodotus, also referred to as the father of lies, and his role or impact in the making of modern historical knowledge. Before this talk, and when we were standing on the terrace, we were talking about hobbies and what we actually do outside of work. And Suzanne was talking about her children, totally distracting her from her work. And they were very important to her because they gave her a very important piece of professional advice, which was, don't be so boring. I can confirm that Suzanne is anything but boring, and we all look forward to your lecture. Welcome, and again, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Barrett, and I will endeavor to live up to that, noble task. I am so pleased and thrilled to have this wonderful audience here in this room and on Zoom, composed of so many scholars and writers from so many different backgrounds and professions and interests, just right, I hope, for tonight's lecture. I'm so delighted that the American Academy saw fit to offer me a Nina Maria Gorison Fellowship for this year. It's already been a huge pleasure and a greatly enriching experience. In fact, it was so enriching that I decided to change the title of this lecture to respond to conversations that I've had with my colleagues and with new interests that I've developed, and also, I hope, to be a little less boring. So I have decided not to talk so much about Western Civ, but in fact about lies. I hope that there's something in it for everyone, including the lawyers. Shout out to you, Josh, and also to the classicists and the Near Eastern specialists from whom I have learned so much. But I think my greatest debts in this lecture are owed to the early modern intellectual historians and historians of science, including Lorraine Daston, who is here, and also to Tony Grafton and his many wonderful students from whom I have also learned such a great deal about the 18th century, which will actually feature very prominently in this talk. I am giving this lecture in a place that Herodotus could not have conceived of. In fact, all he had heard of northern parts of the world was that they might be home to gold-footed griffins, but large areas of them were uninhabitable because of all of the bees. But I hope it might capture some of his spirit and some of his commitment to historia, meaning something like incisive and persistent inquiries, a cause I hope we can all support. So let me begin. In part 3 of his Histories, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus tells the following story about Darius and how he came to be the king of Persia. Let me set the scene. The reigning king, Smerdis, is revealed not to be the son of Cyrus the Great, but an impostor. Worse, he is a member of the powerful clerical caste, the Magi. Funnily enough, the impostor is also named Smerdis and resembles the real one, except that he has no ears. When, thanks to a nobleman's daughter planted in the seraglio, the earless Smerdis is unveiled, 7 leading Persian nobles conspire to murder the impostor king. They then hold a mini-constitutional convention and decide that monarchy is the best form of government. Now, however, the conspirators are faced with the question of how to select a new king. According to Herodotus, they agreed that the king would be chosen by the following method. All would meet just outside the city gates of Susa at dawn, and the noble whose horse whinnied first would be king. So Darius asks his clever groom, Obaris, how to cheat, as one does. Obaris obligingly devises a plan whereby on the night before the test, he leads Darius' stallion and his favorite mare to the meeting spot and encourages the stallion to mount the mare. And now we pick up the story from Herodotus. As dawn began to break, the 6 men, as they had agreed, mounted their horses and rode out to the area just outside the city. Just as they approached the place where the mare had been tied the night before, Darius' stallion ran up to the spot and whinnied. At the very same time, lightning appeared and thunder sounded out of the clear sky like the signal of agreement, which added a perfect conclusion to the decision for Darius. The other men immediately dismounted from their horses and prostrated themselves before Darius. That is how some people tell the story of Obaris' scheme, but there is a different version told by others who are also Persians. They say that Obaris rubbed the genitals of his mare with his hand and then kept his hand covered in his trousers. At sunrise, when the horses were about to be released, he took out his hand and held it to the nostrils of Darius' stallion, which upon smelling it immediately snorted and whinnied. That's the end of the quotation. This story tells us much about Herodotus' interests and modes of storytelling. It features a clever groom, an arbitrary rise to power in the wake of a violent change of leadership, a national wonder, animals, and sex. And it delivers some quintessentially Herodotean truths about human nature. Even kings cheat, it pays to have smart servants, sex is the most powerful form of magic. Although modern readers have found in it a great deal of sly defending of Athenian democracy, Aristotle and Montesquieu at least found universal wisdom in the Persians' discussion of governmental forms and their weaknesses. But is there any truth to the story, and if so, what kind? The question of what historical truth meant in antiquity or in the medieval or early modern periods is a gigantic one much too big for tonight. Aristotle and Cicero certainly did not agree on this question, and even in modern times, we have many ideas of what constitutes historical truth. There is the kind of pictorial or theatrical probability that the French call vraisemblance. There is the kind of morally instructive truth we still speak about, especially in works for young persons. And then there is factual accuracy, usually signaled by written documentary evidence. There are stories that are true and documentable, such as that I got a C in geometry in the 9th grade, but are wholly unimportant in the grander scope even of my biography. And there are stories that are of possibly monumental importance, such as whether or not Catherine the Great actually had her husband murdered, that we may never know for sure. There are some people for whom the revelation that there are no agreed-on chronologies for early Egyptian history or a single piece of paper that shows Hitler ordered the Holocaust constitutes grounds for dismissing historians' attempted reconstructions as a tissue of lies. There are others of us who think that precisely those uncertainties are what make history writing an interesting and ever-evolving challenge, and who believe in the improvement, but not the perfection of historical knowledge. As one Oxonian classicist wrote in 1865, how are men, of course we would say people, ever to get on without guessing and feeling their way? End of quote. It is as a modern historian and a believer in the punctuated, never providential improvement of historical truth that I present this paper tonight, taking for my subject the long and twisted reception history of Herodotus, which is the subject of the book I'm working on here at the Academy this fall. The subject is tricky for several reasons, which is perhaps why no one has attempted to write such a book before. Firstly, Herodotus has always had a very wide range of critics, as well as imitators and fans. And secondly, the number and variety of his readers, from schoolboys to churchmen, from Assyriologists to comparative zoologists, from Aryan racists to Afrocentrists, from poets to porcelain makers, and I had to get that in, perhaps outstrips any readership other than that of the Hebrew Bible. One cannot tell a reception history of Herodotus in the more or less straightforward way that one can write that of Thucydides, from Hobbes to Ronke to Henry Kissinger. I also do not see this story, or increasingly any good intellectual history, as one of paradigm shifts, or epistemes that follow one another like train cars or elephants holding one another's tails. The real story lies in concurrent debates between paradigms or elephants, as you'll see in my lecture overview. It is, I believe, in the disputes over Herodotus' truth and lies that most of our modern historical, philological, and archaeological norms and tools have been forged. I also hope to illustrate that very many of our most fruitful historiographical battles have been fought over ancient and Near Eastern histories. If, as Bruno Latour had it, we have never been fully modern, we have also never been fully Western. It's my final wish to show that we have learned a lot by arguing about such seemingly odd and alien stories as that of Darius and his horse. So now part one, Herodotus' truthfulness before modern times. Although I am by no means a classical scholar, I need to say a few things about Herodotus' text and its ancient readers before we can understand the modern history of its reception. Herodotus, who pledged in the opening passage of his histories to tell why the Greeks and barbarians fought and to preserve the great deeds of both sides for posterity, was a remarkable and anomalous figure in the ancient world. He was a man who traveled to see things for himself and to talk to local informants, albeit only those who spoke Greek. It's important for our discussion tonight to remember that his histories cover many, many more subjects than the Greco-Persian Wars proper. Indeed, it is apparent from this cursory table of contents that a relatively connected political narrative of the wars begins only in Book 5. His is also a much more subtle and general portrait of human nature than one might think. If in the first books he indulges his love for salacious stories and Near Eastern wonders, the seldom read books 5 and 6 are chock full of the thoroughly skanky deeds of the Greeks, which include bribing the Delphic oracle and conspiring against their own cities. If current popular histories and movies suggest that what is important in Herodotus' Greece is the heroic rescue of Western freedom over the degenerate and despotic East, this is absolutely not how I read the text or what most of his readers, most of the time, thought his histories were about. It is also important for our purposes to recall that, as Charles Chiasson has underscored, Herodotus was himself, quote, accurately aware that historical truth is a matter of dispute. Believing he has a duty to report what he has heard, Herodotus frequently gives alternative accounts, as he does in the story of Darius and his horse. And he sometimes even reports things he thinks are outlandish. As he says in a very important and famous passage in Book 7, I'm committed to telling it as it has been told, but I am by no means committed to believing it, and this holds true of my entire work. His method is a complex mix of epic, tragedy, and journalism. As Rosalind Thomas showed some years ago, it draws on contemporary medical and natural scientific practices of observation and analysis. But he is not a relentless rationalist, and he believes in divine vengeance, and sometimes, it seems, in oracles and flying snakes. Various forms of history writing and recording predate him, but his combination of curiosity about Scythian horse burials, Egyptian diseases of the eye, and Nashmonean marriage customs in which the bride sleeps with all the guests, vastly enlarged the scope of what he called historia. Indeed, in modern times, he has been called not only the father of history, but the father of geography, archaeology, anthropology, and travel writing, in part because everyone who entered these fields after him felt they had to pick a fight with him. For anyone who thinks that he was displaced by the Thucydidean model in the 19th century, I can offer you multiple Google engrams to suggest that this cannot be the case. He's the blue line in all of these maps. And yet Herodotus has been anything but a reverently received and dutifully obeyed father figure. Already, Thucydides, his near contemporary, denounced Herodotus' brand of history for pleasing readers rather than telling the plain and often unpalatable truth. For Thucydides, history had to be hard to write and hard to read. Centuries later, in his enduringly popular The Malice of Herodotus, Plutarch denounced his predecessor for intentionally defaming the non-Athenian Greeks and loving the barbarians too much. Alternatively, the Perso-Greek writer Ctesias and the Judeo-Roman writer Josephus denounced him for seeing all of history through distorting Greek lenses. Even Cicero, who gave him the moniker Father of History, also compared Herodotus to the Hellenistic writer Theopompus, who was renowned, as Scott Bruce has said, quote, for his long-winded digressions and his endless bullshitting. It was Petrarch, Arnaldo Mimiliano noted, who first recognized the contradiction, that the father of history was also widely regarded as the father of lies. Many have thought that was a problem, but I hope to show now that in modern times, Herodotus' ambivalent reputation has been a benefit for historians, whether we credit his stories about kings, horses, and clever grooms or not. So now, part 2, the Pyrrhonist challenge and the making of an antiquarian truth-teller. I will tonight have to radically attenuate my discussion of Herodotus between the ancient world and the later 17th century. Suffice it to say that despite his reputation, he was one of the most widely read authors in antiquity, who left his impress, Oswin Murray has argued, on all of Hellenistic culture. But after the fall of Rome and its Greek-reading elite, what survived of Herodotus were chiefly fragments and factoids from books 1 to 4, for this was the material of most use for Christian church fathers. Because, as David Chytraeus would later argue, this material was most likely to confirm specifics of the Hebrew Bible. Recall, however, that this very same material that the church fathers so valued was also the location of most of what Cicero referred to as endless bullshitting, which may be why, by the time of the Renaissance rolled around, Herodotus' reputation was still very vexed. He was still regarded as an inveterate liar by Erasmus, Joan Vives, and Jean Bodin, just to mention several notable critics. Lorenzo Valla had put a full Latin translation into circulation as early as 1474, but still everyone argued about the first books. Henri Estienne's Apology for Herodotus, first published in 1566, defended his wonders on the grounds that the blasphemy and crimes of the Catholic Church were far more astounding than any of Herodotus' stories. But this did little to redeem the credibility and moral probity of the Greek father of lies. Now, in general, Greek historians were not very popular before the 18th century, as this recent rundown of editions and translations from 1450 to 1600 indicates. Note how much less popular Herodotus was in this era compared with Sallust or his great critic Plutarch. For Renaissance historians, Herodotus was a particularly problematic ancestor. Although many admired his style, there was widespread agreement that given all the sex, animals, and impaling of enemies, the histories were insufficiently noble for the instruction of young men. Note that what is wanted from a history in this context is an improving moral lesson, not the factual accuracy of the text. Not surprisingly, as Stefan Kipf has shown, these factors made Herodotus little read even in the humanistic schools of the 16th century, and even less so in the combatively confessional 17th century. Princes, statesmen, and clerics did not need his brand of truth. In the 16th and 17th centuries, however, there was one smallish group of persons for whom the exactitude of Herodotus' information did matter. the practitioners particularly, but not exclusively, of Protestant biblical exegesis and the hoary science of chronology. These scholars did want to know facts about the ancient Near East, naturally for their own theological purposes. For Isaac Newton, for example, who spent much of his later life trying to crunch chronologies, Herodotus' Book 2 was the key source for the all-important chronology of the ancient Egyptian kings, provided one did not take the Egyptian priests' statements too literally. Chronologists and exegetes certainly did not agree about which parts of Herodotus to trust or how to use his stories, but they dragged him and many other pagan authors into their debates, ensnaring learned theologians in efforts to write universal histories that would not only stand up to doctrinal and moral tests, but also be considered factually true. So we're moving from moral truth to something more like the test of facts. By the end of the 17th century, we have then a clash between two major forms of historical truth. One, the Ciceronian type, known as Historia Magistra Vitae, history as the teacher of morally useful truths, especially for princes, and a chronologer's type, resulting from attempts to crunch and synthesize ancient accounts. For the first group, Herodotus was of little interest, as his moral truths were muddy and his personal integrity, thanks to Plutarch and Vives, suspect. For the chronologers, on the other hand, Herodotus was much more useful as a kind of archive of ancient facts, though no one believed everything he reported. What challenged both of these types of historical writing, however, was another form of thought always dangerous to historians, philosophy, particularly in the form of post-Cartesian Pyrrhonism. Now, Pyrrhonists, in this period, radical skeptics questioned the reliability of received truths. Some were quite radical, calling into question the partiality or plain falsehood of all past accounts and their relevance for modern readers. One Jesuit extremist, Jean Houdin, claimed that there remained only 7 authentic ancient sources, of which Herodotus was one. The rest had been forged by medieval monks. The most aggressive of the Pyrrhonists were strong believers in the superiority of the moderns over the morally corrupt and hopelessly credulous ancients. Bernard de Fontenelle dismissed all of antiquity's myths, oracles, and wonders as nothing more than, quote, errors of the human spirit, which should not be perpetuated. For these skeptics, ancient history and pre-modern texts such as the Histories seemed such a sinkhole of superstitions and lies that it would be best to throw it all away and depend only on pure reason, on current church teachings, or on the truths of the natural sciences as demonstrated in experience. It was the need to marshal new facts against the assault of this corrosive philological skepticism that I think drove theologians, universal historians, and antiquarians to Herodotus' door in search of a much stronger form of historical truth. One of the key locations for this was the French Academy des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, an institution populated heavily by the slightly heretical Jansenists and robe aristocrats trained in the law, eager to use documents and facts to combat absolutist encroachments and papal dogma. Their remedy was to replace skepticism and raison d'etat with the forensic approach of the law. Rather than being summarily dismissed, all authorities deserved a trial. Truth would have to be obtained by combining and comparing witnesses and judging the quality of the evidence. Some ancient sources were fabulous, some less so. One did not have to settle for an all-or-nothing approach to the past. A pagan with a sincere heart, such as Herodotus, might help to fill in gaps in knowledge, just as foreign travel and the collecting of coins or ethnographic material might throw light on the universality of customs or, more dangerously, superstitions. As Jean Bouillet de Savigny, president of the Academy, commented in his essays on Herodotus published in 1746, ignorance was like a battlefield studded by forts. He advised that these forts be besieged one by scholars with different talents. Each of Herodotus' claims would need to be separately tested. But in the meantime, he argued, what more could one wish for than Herodotus' curious and self-critical form of inquiry? Indeed, by the middle of the 18th century, Herodotus was in greater demand and use than any time since the Hellenistic period, both as a source and at least as a partial model. New translations, selections, and adaptations swarmed. For Europeans in the age of Montesquieu, Herodotus appealed not only for the number and variety of facts he supplied, but because so many of these facts pertain to the history of the Near East, perhaps especially Egypt, about which both theological and secular scholars cared very much. Histories connecting sacred and profane realms began to teem with antiquarian details about manners and customs, none more so than Charles Rollin's massively popular Histoire ancienne, written in French in the 1730s and directed at students and laypersons. If Rollin reveled in Herodotus' plethora of ethnographic detail, another member of the Academy countered Pyrrhonist skepticism by defending Herodotus' philo-barbarism. This was an obscure Swiss abbé by the name of Genois, but his 3 speeches defending Herodotus in the 1740s would be invoked by anti-Pyrrhonists for decades to come. Against Plutarch, but also against modern moralizers, Genois asked, quote, "Don't the laws of history require that he reports the diverse traditions of people without bias, and that he retains a strict impartiality?" End of quote. We see here incipient new criteria for trustworthiness developing as the Enlightenment put Herodotus on trial. Where once he was blamed for failing to deliver proper moral truths, he's now praised for being observant, open-minded, specific, cosmopolitan, and impartial. He's become the antiquarian Enlightenment's exemplary ancestor, indispensable until such time as non-Western texts could speak for themselves. Part 3. Rationalist and Philhellenic critics, apologetic and Orientalist replies. There were, however, chinks in the antiquarian's armor, and in their bid to make Herodotus a thoroughly reliable truth-teller and modern critical spirit. For one thing, by no means had all of Herodotus' wonders checked out, or even lent themselves to documentation, and many remained implausible even to his defenders. How could he have known what Kandala's wife said to Gyges? Much of his reportage in the first books was by his own acknowledgement hearsay, and everyone knows how disputable that was in courts of law. Worse for Enlightenment critics, Herodotus had sometimes credited the prophetic power of dreams and oracles and offered improbably grandiose figures for the height of Babylon's walls and the size of Xerxes' army. Perhaps most importantly, those who still believed that history should teach moral lessons to elite men ask, even if it turned out, had there been an Assyrian queen named Semiramis, or if Egyptians still used pigs to plow fields, did such a ragbag of facts add up to something that deserved to be called a history? How were such truths at all relevant for modern Europeans? As one of the leading beaux esprits put it in his encyclopedia on history, if you have nothing to tell us other than that one barbarian has replaced another barbarian on the banks of the Oxus and Euxartes, in what way are you useful to the public? Our administrators seem to ask this of us fairly often, in fact, today. This wit, as you may have guessed, was Voltaire, who at the very same time he wrote this entry was putting the finishing touches on a violently inflammatory account of ancient history, which he titled La philosophie de l'histoire, but might better have been titled On the Absurdity of Ancient Near Eastern History. Voltaire, it is often forgotten, composed a number of biographies, all of modern princes in the 1730s and 40s, and thought of himself at least in part as a historian. But having inherited both the Cartesian Pyrrhonist and the Jesuit rationalist traditions, Voltaire was very ill-suited to appreciate ancient history, bored rigid by what he called, quote, the falderall of Orientalist erudition, and of quote, which he also suspected rightly was being deployed to prop up l'infâme. In the philosophy of history and several subsequent related texts, he vented his hatred for universal histories featuring the ancient Near East, and Herodotus, whose Egyptians and Persians had been so widely discussed, both in antiquarian and apologetic literature, came in for special censure, although, of course, his main target was, in fact, the Old Testament. Applying Fontenelle's tactics of rational disenchantment, Voltaire ridiculed his predecessors for believing Herodotus' stories about Croesus and the Babylonian marriage market. These were fables, he argued in a later text, like those of Bluebeard, the fruit of a crude and disorderly imagination, which amused children and unfortunately also adults, end of quote. Time spent trying to sort out difficulties in Herodotus' Egyptian logos or the conflicting stories of Cyrus' death and Herodotus and Xenophon was for Voltaire time wasted on puerilities. Quote, in the shadows of history, nothing is known except that there were vast empires that lasted a very long time, that there were tyrants whose power was based on public misery, that tyranny was so extensive that it reached the point of stripping men of their virility, that superstition governed men, etc. End of quote. I've sort of seen that in undergraduate exams. After the renewed Pyrrhonism demolition effort, what was left of Herodotus for Voltaire were the 5 trustworthy books describing the wars proper, and in which Voltaire argued one learned about the victory of the Greeks over all of enslaved Asia. The story of freedom's triumph, he concluded, is perhaps, quote, the sole fruit that one can harvest from the knowledge of these remote times, quote. Effectively, then, Voltaire had drawn a line between Herodotus' Oriental prelude of the first 4 books and his final 5 battle books, damning the first to the land of the mythical and the useless, and laying the foundations for what we would later call the Clash of Civilizations thesis. But once again, I have to warn against presuming that Voltaire and the Clash thesis swept the field. If in assaulting Herodotus' Oriental prelude, Voltaire meant to pick a historiographical fight, he certainly got his wish. I've written elsewhere about the massive polemics that ensued, including a very vigorous apologetic response, epitomized by the Jesuit defense of Near Eastern facts, called Herodotus historian of the Hebrew people without knowing it. The most consequential response, however, was that of the now forgotten Greek translator, Pierre-Henri Larcher, who not only led the charge against Voltaire, but subsequently produced a 9-volume French translation of the Histories. This incorporated centuries of patiently excavated zoological, philological, chronological, and geographical findings related essentially and especially to the first 4 books, and despite its failings would form the foundation for modern critical editions thereafter. I hope you'll see here in the work of Larcher and the apologists the resistance even in the age of enlightened Eurocentrism to the lopping off of Near Eastern history as mere fable, and the reiteration of faith that a slow and plodding excavation might show that the ancients still knew a thing or two. This was the sort of counter-rationalist critique of presentism that we recognize too little, but it belongs also to the Enlightenment. Even Voltaire's friend Friedrich Melchior, Baron von Grimm, protested his comrade's rational overreach, contending that it was wrong to judge the past simply on the basis of modern right reason. Peoples in the past or the present might indeed have different customs than we do, Grimm argued. We cannot say that Herodotus' reports on Babylonian prostitution were false just because they outrage current morals. Effectively, this argument, which we might call the there are more things in heaven and earth argument, would tell against Voltaire in the next decades of increasing historicism and eventually make him the scapegoat for the 18th century's alleged lack of appreciation for the alterity of the past. In the period after Voltaire's death, that is, the great age of Edward Gibbon, forensic historical research did indeed triumph over Pyrrhonism. And in this era, it was Voltaire, not Herodotus, whose reputation suffered most from his polemical attack on Near Eastern facts in the philosophy of history. Part 4, 19th century critics and believers. Even in the 19th century, the question of the value of Herodotus' histories and his truthfulness was by no means resolved. Many students of modern historiography have pointed to the relentless juxtaposition of Herodotus and Thucydides over the course of the century, and noted rightly that Thucydides, at least among the academic historians and classicists, won hands down. But what they have not seen so clearly is that this debate was in fact much wider than among just historians proper, and that actually as decipherments and archaeological excavations proceeded and the sources for ancient history expanded, Herodotus actually grew more rather than less trustworthy, although he also grew increasingly less vital to non-Western experts as the source base increased. Let us first meet the anti-Herodotean faction, which was particularly strong in German universities, but also had strong resonance in Britain. In the German states, the combined forces of the Greek quest for independence from the Ottomans, the specialization of classical studies, and the expansion of Greek teaching in the higher schools resulted in a rising tide of those who focused only on the Greeks. For these very serious scholars, the application of stricter forms of legal reasoning with respect to eyewitnesses and datable contemporary accounts resulted in the throwing overboard of the 18th century's Oriental and Universal histories, and all the attendant baggage of oversized ants and earless impostor kings. Like Thucydides, upon which Leopold von Ranke wrote his dissertation, they presumed that history should be based on written, datable texts and should treat serious subjects, such as political decision-making, war, or the origins of modern nations. Real history was a serious business for men who could not be bothered to sort out the truth of Herodotus' Oriental fables. Thomas Macaulay and Julius Schlosser were by no means alone in characterizing Herodotus as a credulous child, whose chief error was to believe the lies peddled by his Egyptian and Persian informants. Serious historians would not write about Herodotus' warrior queens or about singers who were rescued by dolphins. In the move that Martin Bernal described as rejection of the ancient model in his notoriously controversial Black Athena of 1987, they now refuted traditional claims about Greece's debt to Egypt. For scholars such as Karl Ottfried Müller and Johann Gottfried Droysen, history began only with the Greeks. The rest was myth, or in the words of Hegel about the ancient Orient, a dream. Indeed, quite suddenly, in about the 1830s, Europeans started to care more about Herodotus' battle books than the Oriental prelude, and to swear that real history began at Marathon. Indeed, the battles were now featured as the moment of Europe's rescue from, as E.A.S. Creasy bizarrely put it, quote, the diadem, the tiara, and the sword. Some translators even changed Herodotus' title, for the first time calling his book not the Histories, but the Persian Wars. A number of school editions took out all or most of the contents of books 1 to 4, and especially book 2, and stripped out the Oriental digressions. When near the end of his life, Leopold von Ranke rather ill-advisedly returned to the revising of his lectures on universal history that he had given in the 1820s and 30s, he succeeded in wringing all the life from our tale of Darius and Obarus. All that he told us, he wrote, was that the Persians were convinced that the younger son of Cyrus had been murdered and were not willing to tolerate the usurpation of the Magi. No wise grooms, no horse sex, just another Oriental power play seasoned with a whiff of anti-clericalism. By stripping Herodotus' preludes of its lies, history had become a scientific and Western civilization, scientific discipline and Western civ given a secular Greek foundation, but at what a cost. One of the things we forget about the 19th century, however, is that not everyone was singing the same positivistic and Philhellenic tune. If gymnasium students were encouraged to focus only on the battle books, others consumed Herodotus in radically different forms, including bad poetry and orientalizing painting. And two, there were many Europeans who could not and did not want to give up on the notion that the ancient Near East was not only knowable, but was also vital for Europeans and for their civilizations past and future. This motley crew included theologians, Orientalists, geographers, and archaeologists, the descendants of our chronologers and antiquarians, practitioners of something like Historia, who did not give up on the relevance of the East. They proceeded, indeed, along the lines suggested by the Academy of Inscriptions, by collecting material data, such as pottery or coins, or verifying by autopsy Herodotus' monuments and wonders. There were legions of these fact-checkers, of which we just might mention two, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, who spent weeks of his travels with Napoleon checking to see if the crocodiles actually did what Herodotus said they did, or Claudius Rich and the many later visitors to Babylon who carefully measured the city's walls and tried desperately to get a recreation of the Temple of Belus out of them. And here are just a few of those fact checkers. In addition, a whole industry arose in the fact checking of Scythian geography and customs. Thanks to this mostly amateur labor, by the turn of the century, all sorts of things that had once seemed mythical had now taken on some kind of reality. Not only Troy and Mycenae, but Nineveh, the Buddha, Babylon, the Flood, and the Hittites. In 1884, Ernst Fabricius of the German Archaeological Institute confirmed Herodotus' reports in Book 3 of the Great Aqueduct of Samos. Flinders Petrie's excavations of the labyrinth at Hawara and the great Greek city at Naucratis in 1884, 5 seem to complete Herodotus' vindication. Of course, the more Fabricius, Petrie, and their descendants increased the number of comparanda and developed new tools such as pottery sequencing, the more they could do without Herodotus and flesh out the Egyptian, Assyrian, and Persian histories that so long eluded Europe's grasp. It is in this sense that Arnaldo Momigliano once wrote, quote, "Trust in Herodotus has been the first condition for the fruitful exploration of our remote past," end of quote. The efforts of these many, mostly unsung inquirers were addressed to checking the truthfulness of Herodotus' reportage with respect to empirical material evidence, whether archaeological, geographical, zoological, or epigraphic. If they did not necessarily find what they were looking for, they did find a lot of stuff, much of which fills Europe's museum basements today, to the detriment, of course, of the territories stripped of their treasures. We can and should consider how to make restitution for all of this pilfered and extorted property. But we should not forget, too, that together with peaceful exchanges with local informants and scholars, this material has helped us assault some of those forts of ignorance Bouhier described, and has vastly improved our knowledge of the ancient Near Eastern world. For a final demonstration of this point, we can turn to the history of ancient Persia, which for centuries proved extremely difficult to reconstruct. That great kingdom's involvement in the Greco-Persian Wars, indeed still today, can only be told from the Greek side, which means chiefly Herodotus. But it has turned out that Orientalizing Greek that he was, Herodotus was not such a fabulist. Already in the 1830s, for example, the freebooting imperial officer Henry Rawlinson was alerted to the existence of the ancient Behistun inscription in western Iran. Fabricius. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Carved at the command of Darius, the inscription, which Rawlinson managed to copy and decipher, illustrates the great king stomping on a Magian usurper and confronting a long line of liar kings. After this find, it was clear that Herodotus did draw on ancient Persian accounts in some way. The horsey bits of this tale, too, certainly draw on Persian customs and ideas about kingship. In a brilliant recent interpretation of our passage at 3.86, the Near Eastern scholar Robert Rollinger has argued that the tale may draw on Near Eastern omens that link the neighing or portentous crapping of horses to illegitimate regime change. Increasingly today, as the great French Persianist Pierre Briand has claimed, Achaemenid history can be written for its own sake, though it would be unwise to discount classical sources entirely. As the Enlightenment antiquarians hoped, by testing Herodotus' propositions in the light of ever-improving Near Eastern evidence, we can get closer, at least, to an understanding of what the poet Robert Graves called the Persian version of the wars, and avoid a Pyrrhonist assault whose conclusion would be that we don't try to know anything more than what we were persuaded is useful or, for us, self-evident. And now, conclusion on the virtues of antiquarian truth-seeking. The champions of forensic history have, I think, demonstrated the existence of some kinds of historical truth in Herodotus' first books. But one still has to ask how many true facts make for a true and good history, and which facts matter to us. Herodotus thought it was too soon to tell, so he left them all in, to the delight and profit of scholars ever since, including Flinders Petrie and Robert Rollinger. In recent times, Herodotus' ecumenicism has even made him something of a hero to post-colonial and Afrocentric thinkers. What is important, however, is that in arguing over Herodotus' veracity, we have done more than just fact-checking. We've also been forced to articulate what we believe are the virtues of the historical researcher, which I've summarized to the best of my ability on this slide. If we were grading Herodotus on these competencies by today's lights, he might rate a C on most of them. But then again, as I firmly believe to be the case, sometimes C students can end up being pretty good teachers. Better, perhaps, than Thucydides or Cicero, who could not have taught us that history is about rivers and creatures and people who believe in dreams, and not just about great leaders and major wars. Might we draw some lessons from Herodotus' grab bag of gold-footed griffins, vengeful tyrants, and superstitious Spartans? For politicians or politics today, apropos of recent events, one might learn that a big bad empire bites off more than it can chew when it attacks a smaller warlike people with a clever leader who is able to make useful alliances with his neighbors. A lesson for writers and other students of human nature. Against relentless claims that as a species we are rational choice seekers, Herodotus gives us Hippocleides, who ruins his excellent marriage prospects by getting drunk and dancing on a table just for the hell of it. Are there still lessons here for historians? Reading Herodotus again might remind us that there are ways to get at the history of the purportedly voiceless. But we have to try new approaches and perhaps bend some rules. In this sense, we might recognize him to be at least the father of the hope that we can know more about the places or people distant in time or lost to conventional record keeping. Even if our original findings are a bit kooky or biased in the long run, others will test them, which will lead to new discoveries and the expansion of history in myriad directions. Just to be clear, I also think that philosophers, rationalists, and even moralists need to keep asking their hard questions too. Cherishing many kinds of truth is what has made our scholarly tradition so rich. But today, I think we particularly need to defend what I have called forensic or antiquarian truth-seeking. Thus, if in the end you ask me, was Darius really made king on the strength of his groom's knowledge of equine sexual behavior? My answer would be, probably not, but you won't catch me dismissing Herodotus' story out of hand. I learned at least that from the father of lies. Oh, and also, watch out for all the bees. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions of whatever variety. Ray, shall we start with you? That would be lovely.
Thank you, Sue. That was a tour d'horizon and a tour de force. I have a question about the inclusiveness of Herodotus. So, because he always errs on the side of including things rather than excluding them, almost no one read him cover to cover.
Right.
And my question is whether or not in your panoramic account of Herodotus' reception, there are certain periods that can be characterized by certain books fading in and out of prominence, so that one gets very different Herodotuses depending on whether or not people are interested in the military books, the Egyptian books, whether they're interested in geography and the like, so that, in a sense, the readers of Herodotus, they stratify themselves. They really aren't anymore in dialogue with one another. And depending on which Herodotus they are reading, they may come to very different conclusions about his veracity.
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful point. I have a few extra things I threw in as slides in case I needed them, and this might come in. useful here. I think this is quite true, and it's one of the things that the early modern scholars and medievalists have alerted me to, is just how different reading is depending on the format in different kinds of codexes, for example, codices in the medieval world, or different kinds of poetic excerpts. This is also true of Herodotus, that he was read in these many, many different ways, and Book 2 was a favorite of the theologians and travelers, whereas Book 7 was the favorite of the military historians. You can definitely segregate. This is data compiled by Stefan Kipf, to whom I'm endlessly grateful for having written this great book about Herodotus as an author in schools. And it shows you the reading in Prussian gymnasium of the different books. And one of the things that's most striking is you can see how the first books, and particularly Book 1, fades as you get towards the First World War, and Book 7 surges. Book 1 is a lot of the stories about Solon and Croesus and Babylon and Persia. Book 7 is where the Thermopylae story is, and this became, one that was used again and again as a pedagogical lesson. So you absolutely can do this and see which bits were read. But you're quite right. Until there started to be, by the end of the 19th century, questions about the whole text, when it was actually produced and finished, and the integration of the parts, kind of new literary criticism begins then. And then people, but only scholars, are the ones who are reading the whole thing. But popular audiences always read pieces. Mitch.
Two questions, but they're really quite separate. So let's just start with the first one and take the philologist's tack of latching onto one of your subordinate clauses. When you were talking about Voltaire, you mentioned just in passing, but of course his real target was the Old Testament. And I would like to ask you to expand on this a little bit, because I was sort of wondering why you were discussing the 18th century, whether the whole debate wasn't really about the Old Testament anyway, and not really about Herodotus. So that's the first question. There's a whole, of course, some of you may know, a tremendous scholarship on the historical validity of the Chronicles and the Kings, those books of the Old Testament, and they turn out to be much better history than people used to think they were. So that's the first question. And the second question, if you have time, is a question about historical imagination. I always have wondered whether Herodotus could have had any understanding at all of what the 19th century detail scholars did. Was his notion of veracity even remotely related to that?
Excellent, hard questions. Let me take the first one, going back to actually a slide before the Voltaire discussion. What's this one? One of the things that certainly, okay, first of all, certainly the target was the Old Testament. One of the things that Voltaire wanted to show was that the Israelites could not have had such a wonderful, important civilization because no classical writers wrote about it. I mean, with the exception of Josephus, there's not any classical discussion about the wonders of the Israelite people. So he's poking fun of the silences in the Old Testament, which he then suggests mean that the whole thing is a bunch of lies. What had gone on before was an attempt to fill in precisely those silences with a lot of detail that connected profane and sacred history, by showing that the Egyptians, Herodotus says, also were contemptuous of and did not eat pigs. And so this must have been something that Moses learned from the Egyptians, et cetera, et cetera. Sennacherib is mentioned in Herodotus, so these kinds of mentions are added up to be a kind of prop to the historicity of the Old Testament. And Voltaire knows that. So what he's doing by taking down Herodotus is pulling part of the rug further out from under the Old Testament. And destroying the wonders is another part of it. If you can then say there are no miracles, neither in Herodotus, neither in the Old Testament, then you have a flattened, ancient history. Excuse me. So this is clearly the end game for him. But it has this collateral effect, and it turns out that his main antagonist is somebody who ends up doing this huge edition of Herodotus, basically, I think, as a kind of proof of concept that, in fact, we can find all these facts about the ancient Near Eastern and Greek world, and that will support a historicist reading of the Old Testament. So I think the Bible is part of this. As you may know, in the 19th century, William Gladstone gets Homer and the Bible all torn up together in the attempt to show that ancient authors, real ancient authors, did have historical facts. Homer was a historical figure, and then by the same logic, the Old Testament writers were certainly historical figures who were also reliable. So these kinds of things are part of the argument. With respect to Herodotus' view of ancient veracity, it is so complicated to figure that out. We would need 7 classicists and 7 maids with 7 mops to try to figure that out, because he has different concepts of it in different parts of the work, in which he will say, this is true, I know this to be true, people say this is true, it's been reported to be the case. Some of it is just impossible to know exactly what he meant. But he seems to have meant, at least part of the time, that these things are verifiable, because he says, I went there, I saw it, and it's there, still there. The temple's still there. The donations to the Delphic Oracle are still there. So the story checks out. So at least some of it is, in the sense of I presented, of empirical kind of proof.
Thank you so much for this lovely lecture. So in reconstructing the kind of reception history of Herodotus, your major sub-theme, or your major focus, seems to be the history of truth, right? So you're interested in Herodotus as a mirror or siphon for the different sorts of truth we need and want in different periods. Forensic truth, moral truth, different sorts of other epistemic virtues. And if you track that, another, though, then sub-theme of yours seems to be the kind of relationship of East and West, right? You've got this clash of civilization sub-theme, and so I just wondered, do these two things kind of map onto each other in some sort of meta or structural way in this? Or is there kind of relationship in this project as it's evolving more coincidental? Like, how do you understand the relationship of these two themes, history of truth and history of East and West?
I hope someone can help me with that question, because I don't really have a straightforward answer, but I think the answer is that they are not directly related. There is a story certainly about the emergence of this concept of the West and of Western, the beginnings of Western history in 480. That's a particular story I want to tell, but it is not necessarily the same one as the series of questions about historical truth I'm just describing, or maybe someone in the audience can help me with that and see the connection. But there are different stories to be told about this reception, and so far as I know right now, those two don't map exactly onto one another. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to go on with this question. It seems that the reception of Herodotus was revolving around the opposition of truth and lie. And now there are some historians or philosophers or historians who think, who don't give a damn about this question. Two I would like to give. There's Nietzsche with his advantages and disadvantages of history for human life. We would think this is not the most important thing, whether something is true or a lie. And then that would be my question to you also as an American historian. In the 1970s, we have postmodern historians who would also hold Hayden White, maybe the new historicism, Stephen Greenblatt and others who would also hold that this opposition between fiction and faction is a false opposition and would lead us in the wrong direction. Did Nietzsche and Hayden White read Herodotus and say something?
I don't know the answer to that. Herodotus, Nietzsche almost must have done. I can't imagine that he didn't. Hayden White, I just don't know. Maybe someone has a clue about that. But I think this is the kind of really what I describe Pyrrhonism or moral judgment that I think we just ought to resist. I don't think that is a way forward for the humanities. I don't think it's a way forward for rich human life to not learn any lessons from the past or think that anything that happened before us has no truth or bearing or interest. What a impoverished life that would be. So I'm very much in favor of us keeping a distance from those perspectives. As much as I understand their power, I think they are destructive and only destructive, really, in the end of the day.
Thanks, Suzanne. That was really great. I have a question about the extent to which people are using these ancient texts as data themselves to try and understand, first of all, do we know that one person wrote all of this, or was it written by a coalition of people? But then there's there's work that now can use through, linguistics and other kind of quantitative analyses to pull out, instances where phrases are used in particular ways to indicate some data, and also how the relationship that the author has to the importance of the particular claims. So you alluded to this a second ago where you said, and I wanted to follow up on that. You said something to that effective. The way he reports certain things, he does so in different kinds of ways, which you might read into be his statement about how truthful the thing is that he's reporting. And so I'm wondering if anybody's doing any kind of quantitative analysis like that, and then whether or not when he is reporting this kind of, here it is, but I don't believe it, not to bring Trump into it, but it does have that rhetorical flavor where I want you to believe this thing and I want you to be softened up to take in what I'm telling you by telling you that maybe I don't fully believe it, but I'm just planting the seed and then maybe we'll all believe it together, whether or not there's any of that that's going in there. So that's a question about the language in the work.
So interesting. I think he certainly plays lots of rhetorical tricks, and there are lots of stories that have very clear, or at least now, with modern sort of interpretation and philological understandings, clear kind of jokes or clear Greek references, or he tells a particular story to make a certain point, to make the Persians look bad and the Greeks look better. But there are a lot of stories that they don't all go in the same way. So a lot of the Greeks are made to look really bad a lot of the time. And even people, sort of heroes like Themistocles, he basically says, he's kind of a greedy rat after all, and he's planning for later on when he might have to run away to Persia, which he will eventually do because he'll be ostracized. And it is not, even Leonidas, the great, Leonidas, Herodotus' account basically says he was kind of superstitious and didn't want, the rest of his line to die. And this was not really about fighting for Greece, it was about fighting for Sparta. There's a lot of countervailing, positions there. And I think one of the reasons he was so discussed in the ancient world was that everybody was aggrieved by one thing or another he said. It didn't please anybody perfectly all the time. So that kind of duality means that it's not just a sort of gesture to get you to believe a whole load of goods. It's, I'm going to really give you all kinds of different stories. We don't think, or classicists, I should say, do not think, I don't know that they've ever thought that there was, a multiple sort of authorship of Herodotus. There are too many continuities in the text and similar kinds of language and gestures and so on. There are lots of arguments about what order he wrote things in, whether he actually intended to write an entire history of the Persian Wars at first, or whether he thought he was just going to write some geography and then he tacked on the history after. Lots of those questions come up about the composition and so on. But no one, I think, has the sort of Homer dispute, like was there a real Herodotus? He was not well, but he was attested as a historical figure, and I think nobody disputes that he wrote it. It's just a matter of how and with what techniques. Yes.
Sue, this was totally riveting and fascinating. So thank you for everything. The question I have, I'm totally out of my comfort zone here because I know nothing about classics, so I'm going to ask it and you'll tell me if it's just laughable. So much of what you demonstrated in this talk is through this reception history, the way in which Herodotus is, as you put it, a cipher for these different ways of thinking about veracity, verisimilitude, things like that. What is truth from the perspective of historical accounts? But it was also, as you demonstrate, a story about how this reception was a Western story primarily, right? About how people were viewing some others. And I was curious whether there are moments in the history of Herodotus's reception where there are folks who are scholars who might have recognized themselves or the history of their own nations or people in the accounts of Herodotus. Are there Egyptian scholars who read back to it and try to either embrace a past that was described by Herodotus or disavow it for other kinds of reasons? Do you have any sense of what's going on in the Near East in scholarship, reading these works and trying to see themselves in it or not?
Well, I'll answer a bit of that question. Okay. Where's Sebastian? I'll make him answer more of it if he cares to. There are certainly figures in the ancient world, Josephus, who, although he wants to cherry pick Herodotus because he really wants the line about Syrians of Palestine who are circumcised, because that gives him, a pathway to prove the existence of the Jews. And then there are Egyptian writers who, like Manetho, who does a King's List and who writes about Herodotus and says, he's a liar, and Ctesias, who's a Perso-Greek figure who says Herodotus is a big liar. So there are a bunch of ancient figures who do this. It's really interesting to see what the more modern reception is, but I will tell you that there is a very interesting, strong line of Afrocentric thinkers who love Herodotus and who take passages from Volume 2 as their central set of claims about the Egyptian origins, the African origins of Egyptian culture and civilization. And that's, this goes back to Edward Blyden in the 19th century, and W. Du Bois mentions it. So this is, also a point of resistance in Herodotus that can be used also against claims made by the Greek Philhellenists that Egypt couldn't possibly have influenced Greece, and Egyptians couldn't possibly have been black. So it's there is something there for a lot of people to hold on to. Alex?
Thanks so much. Thanks. I'm not very strategically seated here. Thanks so much. That was fantastic. And I'm still grappling with my question, so I hope you'll forgive me if it's not very well formulated. But I'm interested in the tension between the pedagogical aspects. Especially you showed us this beautiful graph of Prussian gymnasium curricula over the 19th century. So on the one hand, we have the pedagogical tradition of learning ancient languages, which was so important, certainly in the 19th century and many other centuries as well. And on the other hand, we have the historical import. And there seems to be an interesting tension here. And, as someone with medium Greek, we did read Herodotus because it's relatively easy, and you learn your reported speech and your ACIs and all the things that you need, and so that happens fairly early on in learning ancient Greek, and that also perpetuates a certain knowledge, understanding of Herodotus that you might not necessarily want as history professionalizes. And I'm just really curious about the tension between those two factors.
It's a great question, because the problem for Greek schoolmasters was that the most interesting stories are all in basically book one, and to some extent book two. So if you want to hook in young people by giving them something interesting to read, then you want to give them book one, particularly. So, book 7 is just like endless, parade of Xerxes' army, unless you want to know a lot about Persian headgear. I mean, it just gets really, really long. So there are certain pieces that you want to use to interest students. So they're always funny about this. They say, okay, the real story begins in book 5. That's when, the real political story comes. So that's the important part. But, actually, we've got to put in some of the stories because that's what the kids will like. And there are all of these kids' books written with the stories of Herodotus, and they're all from the first 4 books, because that's where, that's the poetic material, the Ring of Polycrates, and that's where all kinds of the stories, Arion and the dolphin, that's where the well-known stories come from for the most part. Any other questions? Thoughts? Well, shall we? Yes, Mitch, one more?
I don't want to keep us from the wine, but I did want to respond to one of the earlier questions. It seems to me that the dichotomy of truth and falsehood is indeed questionable, simply because it's too simple. And what is the matter? What is wrong with having a history of discourse in which Herodotus is included, whether he's telling the truth or not, because the stories have a life of their own, historically speaking. And at that level, it's a separate question from whether they're true or not. Mm-hmm. It's a question about their real historical impact, which can also be demonstrated. Mm-hmm. And what's the matter with having that level included?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I also think it's important to hold on to the possibility that you can know something about the past and that it's not all just made up, or all fiction or something that can be manipulated politically, because there's resistance in some of that material. There's a way also to provide the filler, the material, the inspiration for later generations for whom, right now that might not be relevant, but later on it may give them points of entry, it may give them resistance pieces that they need to write new stories. And if we just run roughshod over it all and say it's all just false, we lose that absolutely crucial part of also our heritage and what we have accomplished as humanist scholars. So maybe that's a good place to end, is with that endorsement of the history of scholarship as something we need to continue to reflect on as something that is worth keeping in our tradition. So thanks, everybody, and have some wine.